That particular porcelain bird, the one with the chipped wing that always sat in the mantelpiece, just to the left of the tarnished silver frame. I remember how its shadow used to fall across his favorite armchair in the late afternoons. He never noticed the chip, not once in the 37 years it sat there. It was a faint line, barely visible unless you caught it in just the right light, a hairline fracture in the smooth glaze, like a hidden fault line. It was there before he died, long before, but after his last letter it felt like it had deepened, a silent, knowing crack. And for a second, no one said a word. If this sounds like your silence, stay. You don't owe them your forgiveness. Not anymore. And if you know a woman who carried too much for too long, give her this story. He wrote it 3 days before the end. The hospice nurse, bless her, had folded it neatly and placed it on my nightstand, a small white rectangle against the cool linen. "He wanted you to have this," she'd whispered, her voice kind, oblivious to the weight of that paper. I didn't open it then. I couldn't. The scent of disinfectant still clung to my clothes. The echo of his labored breathing still filled the quiet rooms. It sat there for weeks, a ghost in plain sight, a final unread testament. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I'd reach out, my fingers just grazing the edge, but I'd always pull back. Fear, I suppose. Fear of what it might say, or more accurately, what it wouldn't. You call it tradition, but I was the only one bleeding from it. On my 65th birthday, the house felt too full, and yet profoundly empty. The children, grown and bustling, brought flowers, laughter, and the kind of loud, well-meaning cheer that makes a quiet woman's head ache. They spoke of him, of course, their father, with a reverence that felt incomplete. They remembered the good parts, the strong hand, the booming laugh, the provider. They didn't remember the silences, the long, drawn-out absences, even when he was in the same room. They didn't remember the slow fade of my own voice, the way I learned to fill the quiet with needlework and gardening, anything to avoid the stark, echoing space where true connection should have been. The letter was still on my nightstand, an unopened wound, a final, unacknowledged lie. I went to the backyard where the old brick incinerator stood, crumbling and overgrown with ivy. He'd built it years ago for garden waste, for old papers he deemed useless. He never imagined I'd use it for something so sacredly profane. The sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the lawn. The air was cool, almost crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. I held the letter, finally. The paper was thin, almost translucent against the fading light. His familiar, elegant script, a flourish of loops and sharp angles. I didn't need to read the words. I knew them already, in my bones, in the deep-seated weariness that had settled in my soul decades ago. It would be an apology of sorts, I knew, but one devoid of real understanding, a regret for things he thought I wanted to hear, not for the truth of what he had taken. A final performance, even in death. I didn't hurt them. I just finally stopped holding the guilt they gave me. I struck the match. The small flame danced, fragile but persistent in the gathering dusk. I watched it not with anger, but with a strange, profound sense of calm. This wasn't about revenge, it was about release. The edge of the paper caught, curled, then blackened. The flame climbed, devouring his words, his elegant lies, turning them to ash. The ink shimmered for a moment, then vanished. A faint wisp of smoke, barely visible, drifted upwards, merging with the cooling air. There was no grand gesture, no cathartic cry, just the quiet sound of paper burning, a soft crackle, and then silence. A different kind of silence, one that finally felt like my own. The chipped porcelain bird on the mantelpiece I imagined finally breathed. The silence after was not empty. It was full, like a quiet room after a storm has passed, leaving only the scent of wet earth and clean air. I didn't feel lighter. Not exactly. It was more profound than that. It was as if a weight, one I hadn't realized I was carrying, had simply dissolved. Not dropped, not thrown off, but dissolved into the ether, leaving no trace but the faint warmth in my fingertips from the last ember. My children, inside, were still laughing, still oblivious. They'd never known the full burden, the slow, steady erosion of self that comes from living beside someone who sees you only as a reflection of their own needs. And for a second, no one said a word. He'd always had a way of making his absence felt more acutely than his presence. Even when he was physically there, his thoughts were often elsewhere, his gaze distant, fixed on some internal landscape I was never invited to explore. He'd bring home flowers after an argument, a peace offering, but his eyes would be flat, unseeing, as if the gesture itself was enough, without the need for genuine connection. I used to rearrange those flowers, placing them just so, trying to coax life from them, trying to believe in the sincerity of the gesture, even as a cold knot tightened in my stomach. It was like living with a ghost who occasionally left tangible gifts. You call it tradition, but I was the only one bleeding from it. There was a particular Christmas. I must have been 40 then, the children still small, their faces bright with innocent expectation. He'd been working late, as usual, and arrived home just as we were about to open gifts. He walked in, smelling of stale cigarette smoke and something else, something I couldn't quite name but which prickled at the back of my throat. He kissed me on the cheek, a dry, perfunctory press, and then turned his attention to the children. Later that night, long after the wrapping paper was tidied and the children tucked into bed, I found a silk scarf in his coat pocket. Not a scarf for me, it was too vibrant, too daring. I folded it carefully, placed it back, and never said a word. The next morning, it was gone. And for a second, I thought I could hear the silence of 100 unasked questions. I didn't hurt them. I just finally stopped holding the guilt they gave me. That scarf, like the chipped bird, became another quiet fracture, another unacknowledged wound that healed over, leaving a scar no one else could see. I learned to live with these scars, to navigate my life around them, to pretend they weren't there. It became a kind of performance, a silent act of resilience, where my smile was a mask and my quiet demeanor a carefully constructed wall. I poured my energy into the children, into the garden, into community work. Anything to feel useful, to feel seen, even if it wasn't by him. The silence between us grew, not hostile, but simply vast. A desert of unspoken truths. There was a particular scent he favored, a sharp, woodsy cologne that clung to his sweaters even after washing. For years after he was gone, if I caught a whiff of something similar in a crowded grocery store or passing a stranger on the street, my stomach would clench. It wasn't grief, not exactly. It was more a phantom limb sensation, the echo of a presence that was never truly present. I remember once, finding one of his old cashmere sweaters tucked away in a drawer, long after I'd given away most of his things. I held it to my face and the scent was faint, almost gone, but it was there. And for a second, I felt the familiar weight, the familiar ache of what was missing and what had always been missing. And for a second, no one said a word. His mother, a woman of formidable silences herself, had always praised his steady nature. "He's a rock, dear," she'd say, patting my hand with a dry, papery touch. "You're lucky to have such a grounded man." I'd nod and smile, a practiced, polite curve of the lips, while inside I yearned for a tremor, a shift, anything that indicated a heartbeat beneath the granite. A rock offers stability, yes, but it also offers no warmth, no yielding. It stands, immutable, indifferent to the vines that try to climb its surface, or the erosion that slowly wears it down. I was the vine, stretching, seeking light, and finding only stone. You call it tradition, but I was the only one bleeding from it. I started collecting seeds, tiny, almost invisible promises of life. Every spring, I'd meticulously prepare the soil, press the seeds into the earth, and then watch, with an almost desperate patience, for the first green shoots. The garden became my sanctuary, a place where growth was visible, tangible, and responsive to care. Unlike other aspects of my life, the more I nurtured it, the more it flourished. The vibrant blooms, the sweet scent of jasmine, the buzzing of bees, these were my conversations, my connections, my quiet victories. They asked nothing of me but consistency, and they offered beauty in return. It was a fair exchange. I didn't hurt them. I just finally stopped holding the guilt they gave me. One afternoon, years before his illness took hold, I was pruning the roses. He came out, stood on the patio, watching me. He rarely did that. I straightened up, my pruning shears still in hand, a little surprised. "You spend too much time out here," he said, his voice flat, devoid of curiosity or admiration. "The house needs attention." He turned and went back inside, leaving me standing amidst the thorns and the fragrant petals, the words hanging in the air like a cold mist. It wasn't a criticism, not really. It was an observation, an implicit judgment, a quiet dismissal of my world. The house, to him, was a reflection of his order, his comfort. My garden was simply a distraction from my duties to his domain, and for a second, the sun felt cold on my skin. After he passed, there was a period, perhaps a year or two, where people would ask, "How are you doing, dear? Are you lonely?" And I would always offer the expected answers, the platitudes about moving forward, about finding strength. But the truth was, I felt a quiet liberation. The air in the house seemed lighter, the silences less heavy. I started leaving lights on in rooms he would have deemed a waste of electricity. I bought brighter-colored cushions for the sofa, something he would have scoffed at as frivolous. These were small rebellions, yes, but they felt enormous, like reclaiming tiny parcels of a country that had been under quiet occupation for decades. And for a second, no one said a word. His sister, always well-meaning but utterly blind to the nuances of our life, once said to me, "He truly adored you, you know. He just wasn't one for grand declarations." And I remember nodding, a tight smile on my face, thinking of all the small, undeclared wars fought in the quiet corners of our home. Adoration, I thought, surely would have included seeing me, truly seeing me, beyond the role I played in his carefully constructed life. It would have included a curiosity about my inner world, a question about my dreams that went beyond polite inquiry. But those questions never came, and after a while, I stopped waiting for them. You call it tradition, but I was the only one bleeding from it. I found an old box in the attic filled with my mother's things, letters from her youth, pressed flowers, a tiny porcelain thimble she'd used. Among them was a photograph of her, much younger than I ever knew her, laughing with her head thrown back, a wild, uninhibited joy on her face. I had never seen her like that. She had always been the quiet, dutiful wife, just like me. It struck me then, the invisible chain that bound generations of women in my family, a legacy of quiet endurance, of polite smiles masking deeper realities. I looked at that photo for a long time, tracing the contours of her forgotten joy, and I felt a pang, not of sorrow for her, but of a fierce protectiveness for the woman I was finally becoming. I didn't hurt them. I just finally stopped holding the guilt they gave me. On the anniversary of his death, my children gathered again, solemn and respectful. They spoke of his legacy, of the values he instilled, of the secure life he provided. And I listened, truly listened, without resentment, but with a clarity that felt almost surgical. They saw the facade, the sturdy walls he presented to the world. They couldn't see the hollow spaces within, the rooms that were never truly lived in, the doors that remained permanently shut. And I knew then, with a quiet certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my silence, my gentle execution of his final lingering lie, was not an act of malice. It was an act of profound self-preservation. It was the first breath I had truly taken, unburdened in decades. And for a second, a silent, knowing peace filled the room, a peace that was mine, and mine alone. Now, the porcelain bird with the chipped wing sits on my mantelpiece still, but its shadow no longer falls across an empty chair waiting for a presence that was never quite there. Instead, the morning light catches the chip just so, and it glints, a tiny, almost imperceptible sparkle. It's not a flaw anymore. It's a mark, a memory of a time when I thought imperfections had to be hidden, smoothed over, ignored. But now, it feels like a testament to endurance, a quiet acknowledgement of what was broken and somehow still remains. And for a second, no one said a word. I started taking long walks in the woods behind the house. The path winds, sometimes steep, sometimes gently sloping, through old-growth trees, whose roots knot over the earth like ancient hands. I'd never had the time for such leisurely pursuits before. There was always a meal to prepare, a call to return, a schedule to adhere to. But now, with the weight gone, the hours stretched, inviting me to simply be. I'd stop and lean against the rough bark of a towering oak, feeling its immense stillness, its quiet strength. And for the first time, I felt truly connected to something profound and uncomplicated. It was a kind of belonging I hadn't known existed. You call it tradition, but I was the only one bleeding from it. One spring morning, while walking, I found a small, smooth stone, perfectly egg-shaped, nestled amongst the moss. It fit into the palm of my hand, cool and comforting. I carried it home, polished it, and now it sits on my desk, a simple, unassuming presence. It's a small thing, but it's mine. It doesn't demand anything of me. It doesn't hold unspoken expectations. It just is. And that, I've discovered, is a profound and revolutionary kind of relationship. It reminds me that true value isn't always in what's given, but in what simply exists. untainted by obligation or hidden cost. I didn't hurt them. I just finally stopped holding the guilt they gave me. My conversations now are different. They are fewer, perhaps, but richer. When I speak with my children, I don't feel the need to filter my thoughts, to soften the edges of my truth. I tell them about my walks, about the new rose I planted that bloomed a deeper crimson than expected. They listen, sometimes with a touch of surprise in their eyes, as if seeing a new facet of me they hadn't known was there. I don't seek their understanding of my past. That burden was mine to release, but I offer them the possibility of a different future, one where authenticity isn't a luxury but a birthright. The burning of that letter, that quiet, decisive act, wasn't about erasing him. It was about finally, irrevocably illuminating myself,